The chlorine stung my eyes, its acrid bite a familiar discomfort at these annual neighborhood pool parties. The smell, sharp, suffocating, had a way of clinging to my skin, as if the very air was trying to remind me of something I couldn't quite shake. 44 years old, and I was still attending these events, still dutifully showing up like clockwork, as if some unseen force made it an obligation. Every year it was the same routine, the laughter of children, the chatter of neighbors, the clinking of glasses, all blending into a background hum I had long since stopped hearing. It wasn't that I didn't enjoy seeing familiar faces or watching Chloe, my daughter, revel in the carefree moments of youth. But deep down, there was always this quiet sense of suffocating expectation. A feeling that I was simply marking time, attending out of some misplaced sense of duty rather than genuine enjoyment. I stood at the edge of the pool, watching Chloe splash around with the other children. Her laughter, bright and innocent, rang out like music, a sharp contrast to the dull ache in my chest. She was a reminder of everything I loved and everything I'd lost. Her joy, her youthful energy, it all served as a cruel reminder of the way I once felt about life. Once upon a time, I too had been that carefree, full of hope. But somewhere along the way, I had become weary. Life had a way of wearing you down, and I was no exception. Mark, my ex-husband, was there too, of course. He was always there. That was his way. No matter what had happened between us, no matter the years that had passed, Mark was the social butterfly who effortlessly charmed everyone around him. He was the type who made you feel like the world was his oyster. That very confidence, the ease with which he moved through the world, was part of the reason I had fallen in love with him in the first place. But now, as I watched him from across the pool, I felt nothing but a sharp sting of resentment. There he was, talking to Sarah, his new girlfriend. Sarah, with her long, impossibly slim legs and a smile that never seemed to fade. She was everything I wasn't, young, carefree, effortlessly radiant. A sharp pang of bitterness tightened in my chest as I watched them interact. It wasn't jealousy, not exactly, but rather a sense of frustration. Sarah represented a part of Mark that I had never truly understood, a part of him that seemed so removed from who I had known him to be. She was the embodiment of a life I no longer shared with him, a life that seemed so foreign and disconnected from my own. Mark caught my eye from across the pool. His smile was wide and effortless, but there was a strange glint in his eyes that I couldn't quite decipher. He raised his glass in a half-hearted salute. I returned the gesture, my smile tight, my stomach twisting. That simple exchange, that simple gesture, was enough to send a flood of memories rushing back. The way we had once looked at each other with such certainty, the promise of forever, the joy of our wedding day. Those moments felt so distant now, like something out of another lifetime. I could almost see the images of our wedding photos in my mind's eye, the two of us younger, so full of hope, standing together in front of a smiling crowd, our hands entwined, promising that we would never part. The image was so stark, so vivid, and yet here I was, standing alone at the edge of the pool, watching as Mark, my Mark, laughed and flirted effortlessly with someone else. I forced myself to look away, to push the thoughts out of my mind. But they lingered, like shadows that refused to fade. The chlorine in the air, the noise of the party, the hum of idle conversation, everything felt distant, muted, as if I were an observer, not a participant in the life I had once shared with him. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, cool shadows across the manicured lawns, I felt a strange urge to escape. The laughter of the children and the light chatter of the adults began to grate on my nerves, each sound sharpening the loneliness I felt deep within. I found a quiet corner near the far edge of the pool, where the shadows grew long and the noise of the party seemed to fade away. I took a sip of my wine, but the liquid was lukewarm, unpleasant. Still, I drank it, the bitter taste matching the ache in my chest. It was all I could do to not let the flood of memories overwhelm me. The evening air grew cooler as the last traces of sunlight faded, and still, I found myself alone. The other guests mingled, laughed, and exchanged pleasantries, but I remained on the fringes, detached from it all. It was a familiar feeling, the sense of being an outsider in a life that had once felt so familiar. How had we gotten here? How had we ended up in this place, so far from where we had once dreamed we would be? I didn't expect it when Mark approached me. There had been no signal, no sign that this would happen, yet there he was, standing in front of me. His usual swagger, the confident, almost arrogant air that always surrounded him, was replaced with something else, something softer, something unsure. For the first time in years, he looked almost vulnerable. He sat beside me, the space between us filled with an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of silence that stretched on, heavy and thick, like it had been building for years. Finally, he spoke. His voice, usually so strong and sure, now held a trace of uncertainty. He admitted that he had seen me watching him earlier, and with a sigh, he confessed that he regretted the way things had ended between us. He apologized for the hurt, for the pain, for the mistakes. And then, almost in a whisper, he said something I hadn't expected to hear. "I still care about you. I never meant to hurt you so deeply." The words hung in the air between us, fragile and tentative. I wanted to be angry, to lash out, to tell him that it was too late, that the years of resentment and hurt had built a wall between us that could never be breached. But instead, I felt something else, something small, something flickering in the back of my mind. It was a feeling I hadn't experienced in a long time. A feeling of something that could almost be described as hope. I didn't know what to say. The years of silence between us, the years of distance, were not easily erased by a few words. But there was something in his voice, in the way he spoke, that made me wonder if maybe, just maybe, he meant it. Maybe there was more to him than the man who had walked out on me all those years ago. Maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for understanding. We talked for a long time that evening, the hours slipping by unnoticed. The pool, once so full of life, now sat empty, the water still and silent beneath the moonlight. The air was cooler now, the crispness of night beginning to settle in. We spoke about our regrets, our mistakes, our fears. He admitted that he feared losing the love he had once had for me, that he was terrified of making the same mistakes all over again with Sarah. He spoke of his doubts, his confusion, his longing for something he couldn't quite grasp. And I, for the first time in years, spoke honestly about the pain I had carried with me for so long. I told him of the hurt, the loneliness, the emptiness that had followed me since our separation. It wasn't easy. It wasn't a perfect conversation. But it was real. And that was something I hadn't expected from him. I hadn't expected this kind of honesty, this rawness, this vulnerability. In that moment, as I listened to him speak, I saw him differently. He wasn't the man who had walked out on me all those years ago. He wasn't the man who had left me to pick up the pieces. He was a man full of regrets, full of fears, just like me. Under the quiet glow of the moon, we sat together, our conversation stretching late into the night. And though the wounds weren't healed, though the scars of the past would never disappear, something began to shift. A small ember, something that had been long buried, flickered to life in my chest. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was a start. It was the beginning of understanding, the beginning of healing. And as the night drew to a close, as the last guests trickled out, I realized that, for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid to hope. Perhaps we could rebuild something. Perhaps we could find a way forward from the ashes of our past. It wasn't going to be easy. But for the first time, I believed it was possible. As the final remnants of the pool party faded into the distance, I stood up, feeling the cool night air brush against my skin. Mark remained seated, watching me, waiting. We weren't back to where we once were. We weren't even close. But there was something in the air now, something between us, something that hadn't been there before. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like maybe, just maybe, I could learn to forgive. To start again. To rebuild. Perhaps, after all, it wasn't too late. And maybe, just maybe, that was worth believing in.